Granulation is an effect that happens when the pigment in the paint separates and the heavier, darker pigment pools into the hollows of the paper, and then on the hills of the paper you get more dilute, pale, watery color. Not necessarily entirely white, but much lighter than the darkest. You get sort of dark spots in the hollows and light on the hills. This is something that used to happen a lot more with the older paints, but even with modern paints, some colors tend to granulate quite a lot. For example, in the Winsor Newton color range, the French ultramarine granulates a lot, whereas the cadmium yellow pale, for example, doesn't at all. So the brush we use to simulate this would be the wash effect granulation at 100% or the wash effect granulation at 150%. The size, if we pick this one here, the size of the brush comes like that. You can make it smaller. The size of the brush is not going to affect the amount of granulation, simply the area over which it granulates. Opacity, generally speaking, is probably better set about 50%, and the stylus pressure then will dictate how much or how little granulation goes onto the paper. So if we put a little bit of, if you just look carefully here at the top of this there, you see where there's kind of a hollow. If I go lightly over this, you can see that the hollows are getting darker. I'm doing it quite gently there, but you can see that the way the hollow is getting darker there. I can do the same thing over here. If I do it very lightly, there's hardly any at all. A bit harder, and we're getting more of an effect, which doesn't make a lot of sense here, because this is such dilute water, but it can happen. So if I just go a little bit over this like that, then we get, you know, quite a realistic granulation there. Now this doesn't clearly affect the lighter colors on the hills. So for that you need to pick a second brush, the granulation clear. Again, we've got a nice big brush which we can make smaller, and we can drop the opacity down to, let's say, 50%. And if I pick another area, like maybe around here somewhere, and if you look carefully at the hills of the paper here, if I go over this, you can see that it's making the hills light. So if I then combine the two together and do this like that, what I'm getting is a very realistic effect of granulation on real watercolor paper. And even if I do this very hard, you can see that it doesn't, we've now got no paint at all on the hills and still got paint in the hollows. So it's not going over this. And if I go back to the wash effect granulation here and make it very dark, I'm getting crazy amount of paint in the hollows and no paint at all on the hills, which is completely and utterly unrealistic, but it's just for demonstration purposes. Now at 100%, the granulation 100% and the clear granulation is 100% give a very realistic effect, because the brush and the paper are at exactly the same size of texture. But sometimes we may wish to have bigger blobs, say, which don't necessarily exactly match with the paper texture. And so if you pick the 100%, 150% granulation, then again drop that down and maybe drop the opacity down to 50%. Well, if we're going to get larger blobs like that, which will to some extent still go into the hollows, but not perfectly, However, if you pick that and pick the granulation at 100%, okay, and reduce the size and the opacity, then a combination of the two can be quite effective. Again, you can pick the granulation clear, maybe drop again the opacity down a bit, and have that kind of look here, or the granulation clear at 100%. Oh, in fact, I picked the wrong brush. Here we are, granulation clear at 100%. And get that kind of effect like that.